There is a record, a single unremarkable entry buried inside a county document that almost no one has ever requested, that has no satisfying explanation. It is not a ghost story. It does not involve anything that cannot be explained by human calculation, human cruelty, and human ingenuity. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to sit with. In a county of South Carolina, in the autumn of 1859, a man named Elias was buried. He was enslaved. He had no legal last name recognized by any court, no recorded date of birth, no plot of land, no wages, and no rights of any kind. He had, by every measure, the law of that state was willing to apply to him almost nothing except a coffin. And that coffin, plain pine, iron handles, fitted lid, was not ordered for him on the day he died, or even the week before. It was ordered and delivered to the plantation 6 weeks before he drew his last breath. 6 weeks, while the man it was built for was still walking, still working, still walking, still walking. The plantation records note its arrival. A separate bill of sale from a Beaufort woodworker confirms the date of delivery. A physician's note confirms that Elias was still alive at the time. And then nothing, no explanation, no letter between the planter and the coffin maker that survives. No record of why a dying man needed his coffin ordered with the same advanced planning one might use to order a piece of custom furniture. The reason was never made public, but the people who knew, the people who lived on that land, who breathed that marsh air, who had built every structure on that property with their own hands, they knew, and they passed what they knew forward in the postate, what they knew forward in the bed, only way available to them quietly, carefully, from one person to the next, for as long as it took for someone to write it down. This is the story of Elias, of the coffin that waited for him in the woodshed, where he kept his tools, and of what he chose to do with the time he had left. Before we continue with the story of Elias and the secret that outlived him by decades, leave a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To understand what happened at Heron's Rest in the autumn of 1859, you have to understand what Beaufort County looked like in the years before the Civil War turned the coastline of South Carolina into ash and argument and an entirely different kind of map. Beaufort was not like the rough, scrubby interior counties further inland, where the cotton was shorter staple and the tempers were shorter fused, and the Naucus, Buffet, was coastal. It was made of water and marsh and islands, and the light there was different from the light anywhere else in the state. Softer in summer, sharp and cold in autumn in a way that made the live oaks look almost silver, the Spanish moss moving in the offshore wind like something that had been breathing for longer than anyone could remember. The planters who had claimed that land and those islands in the decades following the Revolution had built something they understood to be a civilization. They said so openly, regularly, and with a conviction that went beyond mere defensiveness into the kind of deep belief that can only be maintained by people who have arranged their world so that almost nothing in their daily experience contradicts it. Their houses were large and white, set back from the road behind allays of old trees. Their tables were set with English china. Their children were educated in Charleston, and occasionally in the North at institutions that their fathers then denounced for the ideas those same institutions sent their children home with. Their names Haywood, Fuller, Barnwell, Rhett, appeared in the county deed books and court records with the regularity of prayers generation after generation after generation, as though the land itself had learned to expect them. And beneath all of that, invisible to the census taker who counted them as property, and to the newspaper editor who never wrote their names in any sentence that did not also include a dollar amount, was the community that had actually built everything. By 1859, Beaufort County held more enslaved people than any other county in South Carolina. On the Sea Islands, St. Teen, South Carolina. On the Sea Islands, St. Helena, Ladies Island, Port Royal, Dotto, the smaller ones that barely had names on any map. The ratio of enslaved to free white residents was on some plantations 15 or 20 to 1. In certain fields, in certain seasons, there were hundreds of people working the long staple Sea Island cotton under a sky so wide and so flat, it felt like the land itself was watching. But numbers alone tell you almost nothing about the texture of what life was on those islands. The people who lived and labored there had developed over generations of necessity and ingenuity and grief, something that no enslaver had planned for and no law could easily touch. A culture, a language, gula, a Creole that wove together the West and Central African languages of people who had been brought from different places and who had built something new from the fragments, and a system of knowledge, spiritual practice, social structure, and communication that stretched across plantation boundaries in ways that no overseer fully understood and no master could fully control. They knew the land in ways their enslavers needed to know it. They understood the tides and the seasons of the marsh, the particular silences that preceded certain kinds of storms, the properties of tea, heat plants that grew along the creek edges, the behavior of the fish in the inlets. Without this knowledge, the cotton economy of the sea islands would have collapsed within a single decade. The planters understood this even if they never said so plainly, and it shaped, in subtle, unacknowledged ways, the specific texture of bondage in Beaufort County. It was not less brutal for being pragmatic, but it had its own contours, its own pressures, its own specific species of cruelty. The Drayton family owned a plantation called Heron's Rest. It sat on the western side of St. Helena Island, far enough from the main road that you could not see it from the road, and close enough to the marsh that at certain times of year, particularly in September and October, when the Pluff mud was at its most active and the tidal creeks were running heavy, the smell of the marsh came through every window and door on the property, regardless of what you did about it. That smell is something that anyone who has spent time in the Low Country knows intimately. Salt and sulfur and something organic underneath. Salt and sulfur and something organic underneath. Something that is not exactly decay and not exactly life, but somewhere in the territory between them. It is the smell of a landscape that is neither fully land nor fully water, and that has been sustaining complicated, half-hidden life for a very long time. The main house at Heron's Rest had been built in the 1820s by a man named Hugh Drayton, who was the father of the current owner. Hugh had been a cotton factor's son who had married into the Fuller family and come into the St. Helena property through that connection, and he had built the house with the particular ambition of a man who knows he is the first of his line to hold something this significant and wants the structure. To prove it, he used good lumber, some of it barged from the mainland, and a carpenter from Charleston who had tried, aimed under a man who had trained under someone English. The result was a house that was not the grandest in the county, but which had a solidity to it, a settled quality that some of the showier places lacked. It had survived 2 hurricanes and a fire in 1847 that took the eastern wing and left the smell of charred wood in the walls for years afterward. The fire had never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction, a fact that was mentioned in the county with a frequency that suggested the topic was not quite closed. The current master of Heron's Rest was Hugh Drayton's second son, Wendell. He was 44 years old in the autumn of 1859, and he was a man who had not been raised to inherit. This is a detail that matters. Wendell had grown up in his older brother, Robert's shadow. Robert, who had been groomed for the plantation from childhood, who had gone to the College of Charleston and come back with the easy authority of a man who knows exactly what his life is meant to look like. Wendell had studied law. He had practiced in Charleston for 6 years, handling the kinds of cases that involved commercial disputes and property transfers, and the particular labyrinths of estate law that the plantation economy generated in great abundance. He had been competent at it without being brilliant. He had made the kinds of connections that a second son makes in Charleston society, useful, not transformative. And then in 1851, Robert had contracted yellow fever during an outbreak that moved through the county like fire through dry cotton. He was dead within 10 days. He left no wife, no children, and no will, which meant that by the laws of interstate succession in South Carolina, Heron's Rest passed to Wendell. Wendell had come back to St. Sain in South Carolina, Helena with his wife Catherine and his 2 surviving children. A third had been lost at 14 months to a fever, and he had taken the plantation on, with the specific kind of determination of a man who understands that he is doing something he was not prepared for, and that the consequences of failure are not abstract. He had learned the cotton operation by doing it wrong in the first season, and then more right in subsequent ones. He had kept meticulous financial records. That was his lawyer's training, and had hired an overseer named Corwin, who had the particular combination of physical intimidation and administrative thoroughness that overseers of that type cultivated. He had within 3 or 4 years made her rest function in a way that satisfied the basic expectations of the county's planting community. But Wendell Drayton was not a man at ease. Anyone who watched him carefully, and there were people on that plantation whose entire survival depended on watching the people who held power over them carefully, could see that beneath the composed exterior was something that never quite settled, a calculation that never stopped running, a set of numbers that never fully added up to what they should have. His wife Catherine was from the Collington district, from a family named Bowen that had produced 2 generations of rice planters before the second generation had scattered and diminished. She was 39 in 1859, and she had been beautiful in the specific way of women who are told from childhood that their beauty is their most useful quality, and who learn slowly and painfully what that instruction has cost them. She was intelligent, quietly, persistently intelligent, in ways that her life gave her almost no opportunity to use. She managed the household records with a precision that far exceeded what was strictly required of her, keeping entries in a ledger that was so detailed and so methodically organized that it would later serve unintentionally as the most damning document in the entire affair. She knew things about Heron's Rest, about its finances and its operations and its human geography that her husband assumed she did not know. She had learned over 15 years of marriage that the most effective protection she could give herself was to know everything and appear to know nothing. She and Wendell did not speak of the things that actually mattered between them. They had a language of surfaces: the weather, the children, the neighbors, the cotton that they moved through with the practiced ease of people performing something they have rehearsed for so long. They no longer remember it as a performance. The plantation at Heron's Rest ran on the labor of 34 enslaved men, women, and children. Most of them had been born on the property and had never left it. Some had parents and grandparents who had been born there. The youngest were infants. The oldest was a woman named Leah, estimated to be in her mid-70s, who had been at Heron's Rest since before Hugh Drayton had built the main house, who had been there, in other words, since the land was a different family's problem, and the trees were younger, and the house that stood now was not yet imagined. They grew and ginned and packed the cotton. They maintained the house and the outlings and the dock and the drainage ditches that kept the fields from flooding after heavy rain. They fished the creeks and the sound, bringing in catches that supplemented the plantation's food supply in ways that never appeared in the ledger. They raised the Drayton children in the years before those children went away for schooling. They repaired everything that broke, built everything that broke, built everything that needed building, and kept between themselves a running account of everything that happened on the property, including the things that were never meant to be seen. Among the 34 was a man named Elias. He was 51 years old in the autumn of 1859, or thereabouts, the exact year of his by. Wraith was not recorded in any document that had survived, and like most enslaved people, he carried his age not as a number assigned at a specific date, but as a weight, an accumulation of seasons and events that could be placed roughly in sequence. He knew he had been born in the late 1800s, after the main house had been started, and before the fire that took the cotton storehouse in 1812. He knew he had been old enough to carry water to the men working on the dock construction the year the dock was extended. He had the kind of knowledge of his own age that comes from triangulating against events rather than consulting documents. And it was knowledge that was in some ways more honest than the numbers on a birth certificate because it was grounded in the actual experience of time, rather than in a date someone else had recorded. He was a carpenter. He had become a carpenter in his early 20s when the elder Hugh Drayton had noticed and noted it the way men who thought primarily in terms of assets noted things that the young Elias had a facility with wood that was not common, a sense of proportion, a steadiness of hand and of attention, a patience with the slow, precise work of fitting joints and measuring cuts that some people are born with and many people are not. Hugh Drayton had apprenticed him informally to the Charleston carpenter who was working on the main house at the time, and the carpenter, a man who thought of himself as an artisan, and who had embedded in his professional pride a stubbornness about the quality of his instruction, regardless of who the student was, had taught Elias properly, had taught him the geometry of a roof frame, and the behavior of different wood species in different weather, had taught him how to read a structure the way a physician reads a body, finding the points of stress and weakness before they became problems. Elias had built things at Heron's Rest that were still standing and would stand for many years more. The dock, rebuilt after the 1845 hurricane, was his work, and it was good work, pegged and braced in a way that understood the particular violence the low country tides could inflict on anything made of wood. The smokehouse with its precisely fitted ventilation was his. The modifications to the main house after the 1847 fire, the repairs to the east side, the new framing, the way the replacement section married itself to the original so that you had to know where to look to see the seam, were his. He had built things for the Drayton family that they walked past every day without thought. The way people walk past the bones that hold their house up. His hands were not the hands of a field laborer. They were the hands of a craftsman, the calluses in different places, the particular thickness of the fingers, the small scars from tools rather than from thorns and rough cotton bowls. When he was still, he held them in his lap in a specific way, with a slight downward curl, as though they were waiting for something to hold. By 1859, those hands were slower than they had been. The illness that was taking him had begun, as these things often do, as something easy to explain away. A cough that lingered after a cold, a shortness of breath on exertion that had not been there the year before. Then the weight loss, gradual at first, then more noticeable. Then the periods of fatigue that could not be pushed through the way fatigue usually could be. The plantation physician, a man named Dr. Harlan Voss, who made the crossing from Boward every 3 or 4 weeks to see to the medical needs of the property, had been monitoring Elias since the spring. His notes on Elias are among the more detailed in his practice records, possibly because a man of Elias's financial value to the plantation warranted document chain, possibly because Voss found the case medically interesting, possibly for reasons that would only become clear later. What Voss noted with the clinical detachment of a physician writing for his own records was the progressive deterioration of a respiratory condition that he characterized as a wasting of the lungs. In the vocabulary of 1859, this covered a great deal of ground. Consumption was the most common diagnosis, but there were others, and the specific cause was not something medicine of that era could reliably establish. What was established by the summer of 1859 was the trajectory. This was not something that was going to resolve itself. Not something that was going to resolve itself, not something that was going to respond to the treatments available, and not something that was going to extend itself indefinitely. Voss's notation from July read, "Subject presents continued decline. Expect significant deterioration by autumn. Prognosis poor for survival beyond calendar year." Elias knew he was dying. He had known it before Voss had written it down. He had the particular self-knowledge of a man who has lived in close relationship with his own body for 5 decades, who has learned to read it the way he reads wood, following the grain, finding the weak places, understanding what a structure is telling you about its future. He had said nothing about it to most people. He was not by temperament a man who spoke about himself in that register, but he had spoken to Nora. Nora was his wife. They had been together for 30 years together in the specific sense that was available to enslaved people, which meant a bond recognized by the community they lived in, and the God they prayed to, and the practical experience of their shared lives, but not by any law in the state of South Carolina. They had been through things together that most marriages are not tested by. The worst of those things had been the morning in March of 1848, when 2 men from a Georgia brokerage had arrived at Heron's Rest with the papers for the sale of their son, Joseph, who was 11 years old. Joseph had been sold to satisfy a portion of a debt incurred by the previous master before Wendell Drayton had taken over. It was, in the language of the transaction, a routine commercial matter. In the language of the people it actually happened to, it was something that had no name adequate to its dimensions. Elias and Nora had not spoken of it often in the years since, but it had changed the shape of everything between them. Not broken it, but changed it. The way a bone that has been fractured and healed is not the same bone it was before, is stronger in some places and differently weighted in others. In the late summer of 1859, lying on his side in the small house near the edge of the Heron's Rest property, listening to the sound of the marsh at night, and the particular quality of Nora's breathing when she was not fully asleep, Elias had told her what he believed was going to happen, not the medical facts. She knew those, but what he believed the master was going to do, and what he thought they ought to do about it. Nora had listened without speaking the way she had always listened to things that were serious. When he finished, she had asked one question. He had answered it, and she had said, "Then we need to be careful." What he believed was going to happen was not a simple thing to believe. It required a particular knowledge of Wendell Drayton, of how his mind worked, of what pressures he was operating under, of what options were available to a man in his specific position. And Elias had that knowledge. He had been at close quarters with this family for almost a decade. He had watched the financial anxiety increase in the years since Robert's death, watched the way Wendell's composure stretched and thinned in Serta. In conversations, noted the particular quality of attention he gave to the plantation ledger versus the quality of attention he gave to his family. He knew about the debt, not the specific amounts. Those were in documents he had never been permitted to see, but the shape of it, the way a piece of debt has a shape in a household, the way it changes the air in a room, and the cadence of conversations, and the decisions that get made about things that should be simple. And he had been watching very carefully for a long time. The coffin arrived on the 9th day of October, 1859. It came by cart from Beauwort on a Tuesday morning when the air had finally turned and the first real chill of the season had come in off the water overnight. The driver was a man who worked for the woodworker overnight, a German immigrant named Gard Schein, who had been in Beaufort since the mid-1840s, and whose shop near the market building handled both furniture and coffin construction, as was entirely normal for a craftsman of his trade in a small southern town where everyone who worked with wood, worked with all kinds of it, the living and the dead. The coffin was plain. That is worth noting. Schein's shop produced elaborate coffins when elaborate coffins were requested. He had made burial cases for 2 prominent Beaufort families in the last decade with hand-carved molding and brass fittings that were expensive and intended to be seen. This coffin was not that. It was simple, honest work. Good pine fitted and smoothed iron handles bolted cleanly at the sides. A lid that seated properly along its full length. The kind of coffin a craftsman makes when the commission is not for display, but for function. when it is a coffin for someone who will not be viewed in a parlor with neighbors filing past. It was carried off the cart by two men from the quarters, young men named Henry and George, who had been told by he overseer Corwin to go to the main road and wait for the delivery cart and bring whatever it carried to the back of the property. They had not been told what they were carrying. They found out when they lifted it, Henry told George quietly as they carried it between them on the path around the back of the main house. "This is a coffin." George said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Who for?" And Henry, who had already worked it out from the weight and the dimensions and the date it was arriving, said, "Elias." George looked at him, and then they both looked at the woodshed where they were being directed to carry it, which was the woodshed that stood 100 feet from the small house where Elias lived with Nora. Wendell Drayton was at the back of the house when the coffin arrived. He was standing on the rear porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the cart pull around. He directed Henry and George to the woodshed with a gesture, the kind of brief, economical gesture of a man who has given many directions over many years and has reduced them to their minimum components. He watched the coffin go inside. He watched the men come out. He sent them back to their work. Then he stood on the porch for a while longer, looking at the woodshed door. The cold morning air off the marsh moved around him. He finished the coffee. The door of the woodshed from the small window of Elias's house was visible. Ada saw it all. Ada was 43 years old, and she had been born at Heron's Rest, which meant she had been born into a specific kind of knowledge about this place, the kind that only comes from never having left, from having absorbed it through childhood and adolescence and adulthood without the interruption of distance or comparison. She knew this property the way she knew her own hands. She knew the sound of the main house at night, the particular creak of the third step on the back staircase, the way the kitchen door swelled in wet weather and had to be lifted slightly as it was opened to prevent it from scraping. She knew the habits of the people in the main house, their routines, their moods, their silences, their patterns of movement, the way you know the habits of the weather in a place where you cannot go inside when it turns bad. She served Catherine Drayton as a seamstress and personal attendant, and she had done so for 11 years. She was present in the rooms of the main house in a way that was simultaneously intimate and absolutely invisible, in the sense that she was counted upon and depended upon and never, not once, in 11 years consulted about anything that mattered. She had been mending a dress at the window of the sewing room on the second floor when the cart came around the back of the house. She had seen the men unload the long wooden box. She had seen the direction in which it was carried. She had seen the expression on Wendell Drayton's face as he watched it go. Not grief, not regret, not the particular complicated guilt that sometimes surfaced in the faces of people in his position when they confronted the more direct consequences of their arrangements. Something else. Something that was closer to the expression of a man checking a task off a list. Satisfied slightly, relieved to have a piece of logistics resolved, Ara set the dress down on the work and sat very still for a moment. She was not a person who made decisions quickly. She had learned over the course of her life at Heron's Rest that quick decisions in her position were dangerous, that the impulse to act immediately on knowledge, to respond to the thing you had just seen or heard, was a luxury that belonged to people who had more room to make mistakes than she did. She sat with the knowledge and she turned it over and she looked at it from the not angles available to her. A coffin for Elias ordered now and delivered now when Elias was still alive. She thought about what she knew of Dr. Voss's recent visits. She thought about the conversation she had overheard the previous month between Wendell Drayton and the overseer Corwin, in which Drayton had asked about Elias's current productive capacity. His exact words had been, "What can he still do day to day?" And Corwin had answered with the particular careful caution of a man who was not certain which answer was the desired one. She thought about Elias, whom she had known all her life, and about the specific stillness he had carried for the past several months, and about whether that stillness was the stillness of a man who had made his peace with dying, or the stillness of a man who was watching and waiting. She finished the afternoon's work. She kept her face exactly as it always was, the settled, neutral expression that was her most important piece of equipment in that house. She returned the dress to the cedar wardrobe in Catherine Drayton's room. She said good night to Catherine in the hall. She went down the back staircase, through the kitchen, out the rear door, along the path, through the kitchen garden, and she went to tell Nora what she had seen. Nora was in the small house, and she was alone. Elias had gone to sleep early. He tired easily. Now, his body demanding rest at hours, when rest had once been optional. Arata sat down across from Nora and told her what had happened that morning, and she told her exactly the cart, the woodshed, the direction of Drayton's gaze. Nora listened to all of it, and when Ada finished, she said, "He already knows." Ada looked at her. Nora said, "He's known something was coming. He told me what he thinks they are planning." And then she told Ada what Elias had said to her in the nights when they lay awake and the marsh spoke. Outside the window. Ada sat with it for a long time. The lamp between them burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the palmetto fronds with the dry, papery sound that was the specific sound of that time of year. Then Ada said, "What does he need?" And Nora said, "Time and someone to carry something." To understand what Elias believed Wendell Drayton was planning. To understand what Elias believed Wendell Drayton was planning, you have to understand the specific financial geography of Heron's Rest in the autumn of 1859, and the particular way in which a dying carpenter existed within that geography as both a human being and a line item on a balance sheet. In the antebellum South, the law was unequivocal on this point. Enslaved people were property, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, in the actual operational sense of the word, as used in commerce and law. They were appraised, insured, mortgaged, sold at auction, rented out for seasonal labor, used as collateral on bank loans, transferred in wills, litigated over in probate courts, and listed in estate inventories alongside horses, farm equipment, and silver candlesticks. A skilled carpenter or blacksmith or boatman, a person whose labor generated income significantly above the average, was appraised at a value that could equal or exceed the price of a good horse or several acres of improved land. In his working years, Elias had been appraised at $1,200. This was a substantial number in the 1840s, roughly equivalent in purchasing power to what a moderately successful small farmer might earn in 3 years of good harvests. By 1859, with his health diminishing, the appraisal had been revised downward to $850, still significant, still meaningful on a plantation balance sheet that was under the kind of pressure Heron's Rest was under, because Wendell Drayton was, in the language of his class and time, embarrassed. Not socially embarrassed. Not yet. He had maintained every appearance, the house was kept, the neighbors were received, the season's cotton was planted and harvested and shipped to the factor in Savannah with the appropriate accompanying correspondence. But beneath the surface of that maintenance, the books told a different story, and Wendell Drayton was too precise, a man with numbers, not to know exactly what the book said. The specific problem had its origins in 1854. The specific problem had its origins in 1856, when Drayton had borrowed $3,000 from a Charleston factor named Hollis Crane. Crane was a man of middle age, a Charlestonian by birth, a businessman in the clean and somewhat bloodless sense. He dealt in money and financial instruments with the same emotional neutrality that a physician brings to bodies. He had extended the loan against the plantation's projected cotton yields, which in 1855 and early 1856 had given every reason for optimism. Then 1857 had been a poor season, not catastrophically poor, not the kind of season that broke men outright, but poor enough that the repayment schedule became impossible to meet without stripping the plantation of something it could not afford to lose. Drayton had negotiated with Crane, and Crane, who had no interest in a disruption that would cost him money, had agreed to revised terms, but those revised terms had included a provision written quietly in the language of commercial agreements that are designed to be enforceable without being obvious, that gave Crane the right after a specified period to require the liquidation of such plantation assets, including human property, as shall be necessary to satisfy the outstanding principal. In plainer language, if the debt remained unpaid after a certain point, Crane could require Drayton to sell enslaved people to cover it. Drayton had another year approximately before that provision could be invoked, and he was calculating with the precision of a trained lawyer who had spent 20 years thinking about the structure of financial obligations, what his options were. The most obvious option was to sell the asset with the highest individual value before he was forced to sell it on Crane's terms. A voluntary sale conducted on his own schedule and through his own connections would yield a better price than a forced liquidation. It would also give him control over the narrative. A planter who sold a valuable craftsman to satisfy a debt was exercising prudent stewardship, a different thing altogether from a planter who was forced to sell. The most obvious asset for that sale was Elias, but Elias was dying. And here was the specific legal complication that Drayton's lawyer training had brought into sharp focus. South Carolina courts had over the preceding 2 decades developed a body of case law around something called the warranty of soundness. When an enslaved person was sold, the seller was typically held to be warranting explicitly or implicitly that the person being sold was in good health and free of undisclosed physical ailments that would significantly reduce their value or life expectancy. If a buyer purchased a person who was secretly ill and who died shortly after the transaction, there were grounds for a claim against the seller for breach of warranty. The damages in such cases could be substantial. There were decisions on the books in South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana that Drayton could cite from memory because he had read them during his time practicing law, and because the subject had recently become very personally relevant to him, he could not sell a man who was known to be terminally ill. The risk of legal challenge was too great, and the potential exposure, a lawsuit brought by a sophisticated commercial buyer who had paid nearly $1,000 for a man who died within a year, was not something he could afford alongside the existing debt. But was, at if, in the official record, Elias had already died? If a death certificate were filed with the county, if a physician of record attested to the death of a man named Elias, enslaved property of Wendell Drayton, Heron's Rest, St. Helena Island, then that man would cease to exist as a legal and commercial entity. He would no longer appear on the plantation's asset list. He would no longer be a potential liability in a warranty dispute. He would be in every document that mattered gone while continuing to live and to work as long as he could and to represent off the books invisible, unrecorded a continuing productive asset until the actual death came. The coffin ordered in advance would be there when it was needed. The date on the death certificate filed weeks before the actual death would match the coffin's delivery date near enough, and the body, when it actually came, would be placed in a box that had been waiting for it, and the burial would confirm retroactively the false documentation. It was, in the cold language of financial calculation, an elegant solution to a specific problem. It was also a scheme that depended entirely and without any margin of error on the silence of the people who lived on that plantation, on their invisibility, on the assumption that the knowledge of enslaved people went nowhere, changed nothing, and could be relied upon to stay exactly where it was. This was the assumption that Elias had spent 30 years testing quietly without anyone watching. Because Elias, who was 51 years old and dying, and had nothing that any law in any state would recognize as his own, had a secret that Wendell Drayton would have found genuinely alarming if he had known about it. Elias could read and write. He had been able to do so for more than 20 years, and in all that time, not one person in the main house had suspected it. The acquisition of this skill was its Elf a Story, one of the quieter, more extraordinary stories of what life under those conditions actually produced in human beings. The ingenuity and persistence and sheer determined intelligence that the system was designed to suppress, and that persisted anyway, finding the cracks in the margins in the moments of inattention. The man who had taught Elias to read was named Daniel Primus, a name from the plantation records of the early 1830s when he had arrived at Heron's Rest as part of the settlement of a debt owed to Hugh Drayton by a factor in Charleston. Daniel had been born free in Baltimore, the son of a free black ship's caulker who had earned enough over 20 years to buy property on Fells Point. He had been taken. The mechanics of how remained unclear in what Ada later told Louisa Ames, and the gaps in that story are their own kind of testimony about what the system could do to a life, and sold south, and had arrived in South Carolina without the Baltimore life he had been building, but with every piece of education he had been given in it, which included the ability to read and write with fluency and the habit of mind that education creates, the understanding that knowledge is portable and that no one can take it from you as long as it stays inside you. Daniel Primus had been sold from Heron's Rest in 1836 when Elias was in his mid-20s. In the years before that sale, working beside Elias in the woodshed and the construction sites around the plantation, he had passed what he knew in the only way it could safely be passed. Slowly in pieces in the middle of other conversations, in the small hours when no one was watching. Letters first, then words, then sentences, then practice with charcoal on the back of lumber scraps that were burned as waste at the end of the day. By the time Daniel was gone, Elias had the foundation. The 30 years that followed had built on it, in the way that foundations are built on, slowly, carefully, with what was available. He read whatever he could find access to, however briefly. Newspapers left in the woodshed when someone wanted them discarded, pages torn from books that had been set aside for burning after the 1847 fire. The occasional printed circular that made its way through the plantation community's informal networks. He wrote on scraps that he then destroyed, practicing the muscle memory of the letters without leaving evidence. By 1859, he wrote with an irregular and idiosyncratic hand, the spelling unconventional, the sentence structures built from his own logic rather than from formal grammar instruction, but with a clarity and precision of thought that was entirely his own. He wrote slowly with concentration, and what he wrote was careful. And in October of 1859, in the small house near the edge of the Heron's Rest property, with the coffin sitting 60 feet away in the woodshed where he kept his tools, Elias began to write the most important document he had ever attempted. The document took 11 nights to complete. Elias worked on it after Nora slept, or in the hours when Nora lay awake beside him, but kept her breathing steady and even, and did not look, because she understood that there are kinds of work that a person needs to do alone, that the presence of a witness, even a beloved one, changes the quality of what you are able to say. He worked by the light of a single tallow candle kept low enough that the glow was not visible through the gaps in the door. The physical act of writing was increasingly difficult. His hands were still capable, but his stamina was not what it had been, and the concentration required for sustaining the careful letter forms he had taught himself took more out of him now than it once had. He started with what he knew for certain, the facts he had witnessed the conversations he had heard or partially heard, the physical evidence he had observed, the coffin's arrival date, the timing of Dr. Voss's visits, and the specific changes in the nature of those visits over the preceding months. The question Wendell Drayton had asked Corwin about his productive capacity, the letter he had seen Drayton write from the window of the woodshed where he was working through the glass of the study window 20 yards away. He could not read what was in the letter, but he had noted the day and the person to whom it was handed for delivery to Beaufort. Then he wrote what he believed, and he was careful even here to write it as what he believed, rather than what he knew, because the difference mattered. A man who claims to know what he has only inferred makes himself easy to dismiss. A man who is precise about what he has seen and honest about what he has concluded from it is harder. He wrote about the financial situation at Heron's Rest as he understood it, not because he had access to the ledger or the debt instruments. He did not, but because 30 years of proximity to a household's decision-making, 30 years of observing the way anxiety expresses itself in patterns of behavior had given him an understanding of the plantation's condition that was in its own way a kind of accounting. He wrote about things he had observed, the reduction in the number of new tools ordered for the woodshed over the past 2 years, a change that would not mean anything to someone who did not know what the normal replacement schedule was, but which to him signified something about how tightly money was being managed. The conversations between Drayton and the overseer about labor allocation, in which the calculation of which tasks to prioritize had grown increasingly cautious, the absence in the last season of the visiting factor from Savannah, who had come every autumn are as long as Elias could remember. Then he wrote about other things, older things, things that had nothing to do with the debt or the coffin, but which had everything to do with the debt or the coffin, but which had everything to do with the particular vulnerability of Wendell Drayton's position in the world. He wrote about a transaction that had occurred in 1854 when Drayton had sold 2 men from the plantation to a broker. The men, brothers named Aaron and Marcus, both in their late 20s and in good health, had been recorded in the plantation ledger as sold for $450 each. But Elias had been present by accident of his carpentry work near the window of the study on the morning the broker arrived, and he had heard the conversation that preceded the signing of the papers. The amount agreed upon, which he had heard spoken clearly, was different from the amount in the ledger, not dramatically different, but different in a way that across multiple such transactions over multiple years would represent a meaningful discrepancy in the tax and duty calculations that planters were required to file with the state. He wrote about a woman on the Pringle plantation, which bordered Heron's Rest to the north. Her name was Mattie, and she had been enslaved there for many years, and the relationship between her and Wendell Drayton, conducted on the occasion of Drayton's visits to the Pringle property, which were more frequent than neighborly goodwill required, was known to every enslaved person on both properties, and to no one in the social world of the planter class, including Catherine Drayton, whose household accounts showed payment for goods purchased at the Bowert market on the days when Drayton was occupied elsewhere. He wrote about the fire of 1847. The fire that had taken the east wing of the main house and never been fully explained. The fire that Elias had been asked about by the county sheriff's deputy who came out the following week, to whom he had said exactly what he had been told to say by the then overseer, which was that he had been nowhere near the house that evening. What he had actually seen working late in the woodshed on a piece of furniture that needed to be finished before it was collected was something he had carried for 12 years without telling anyone outside the community of people who had lived on that property. He had seen who had been at the east wing in the hour before the fire started. He had seen what had been carried out of it before the alarm was raised. And he wrote with the most precise language he could manage about the coffin, about what he believed Voss was being asked to do, about the timeline as he understood it, about the fact that a death certificate filed with the county for a man who was not yet dead was itself a crime, not of the kind that would ever be prosecuted in 1859 South Carolina, given the identity of the people involved, but a crime whose documentation in the hands of the right person at the right moment might create a different kind of leverage than a courtroom could offer. The document was 22 pages written on paper that Ada had obtained over the course of several weeks from the main house. Sheets removed from the back of ledger books where the pages were blank from the inside of discarded envelopes from a small cache of writing paper that had been destined for disposal after a supply of better quality was purchased. The pages were of different sizes and different qualities. They were written on both sides in some places, The handwriting was not beautiful, but it was legible, and it was systematic. He had organized it in sections with headers that he had invented for the purpose, indicating which observations belonged to which category of information. On the 11th night, he read it through from the beginning, moving his lips slightly over the words, in the way of a man who learned to read later in life, and for whom the act of reading was still, always partially an act of speaking. He made corrections in the margins. He added 3 sentences to the section about the fire that he had omitted in an earlier draft. Then he folded the pages carefully in the specific way that would allow them to lie flat and inconspicuous inside the lining of a large basket. And he called Nora in from the other room. She sat down across from him at the table, and he told her what was in the document section by section, clearly and without embellishment, because if something happened to the document, the information still needed to exist somewhere. Nora listened to all of it. When he finished, she asked the question she had been holding through the whole recitation. "What do you want this to do?" he said. "I want it to be somewhere he can't reach it, and I want the right person to know it exists," she said. And then he said, "And then the rest is not mine to decide. I can only put it where it can be found. What happens after that, that's up to whoever finds it." He looked at the folded pages on the table between them. He said, "I built things on this land for 30 years. I built things that are still standing and will stand for longer than I will. They put their name on all of it. I didn't get to put mine." He paused. He said, "This is the one thing I'm building that I'm putting my name on. Even if no one sees the name, even if it goes nowhere, I made it and it is true, and it exists and they can't take it back." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand over his hands on the table. They sat there in the light of the low candle until it burned all the way down. The delivery of the document to Ada happened on a Thursday morning, 8 days before Edwin Taband arrived at Heron's Rest. Ada received it the way she received every Angie important quietly, without visible reaction, with the full weight of her attention and without a single word that was not necessary. She knew what she was being trusted with. She knew what the cost of failure would be, not in abstract terms but in the specific concrete terms of what happened to enslaved people in South Carolina in 1859 when they were found to have been involved in activities that threatened the interests of the people who owned them. She did not keep it in the house where she slept. She did not keep it in any place on the property that could be searched if someone decided to search. She folded it into the lining of the large flat-weave basket she used for carrying goods to and from the Beaufort market, a basket she had made herself in the Gula tradition, from sweetgrass and bulrush and pine needles, tightly coiled and flat-bottomed. The kind of basket that had been made on those islands for generations and that she carried to the market every Thursday when the cart went in. The lining of the basket was doubled, and the inner fold created a pocket, narrow and flat, that held the pages without any visible bulge. She had carried things in that lining before, not often, and not always for herself. The basket had been a conduit over the years for objects and information that needed to move without being seen. In the quiet network that operated between the plantations of St. Net needed to move without being seen, Helena Island below the level at which overseers and masters were paying attention. The man she was going to see in Beaufort was named Thomas Waring. Thomas was a free black man, 38 years old, who had been born free in Beaufort to a free mother and a father who had purchased his own freedom from a Colton district planter in 1821. He worked as a dree-man. He owned a cart and a mule and made his living hauling goods between the boot market, the docks, and the various properties in the surrounding area. He had been doing this since his early 20s, and he had constructed in the course of that work an intimate knowledge of the geography of the county, who was where, what moved between which places, which routes were watched and which were not. He could read and write, which in the free black community of Beaufort in 1859 was not universal, but not unusual either, particularly for a man of his family background and his economic stability. He had been educated at a Sunday school conducted by a sympathetic white Methodist minister in the 1830s before the laws tightening restrictions on black education had effectively ended such arrangements. He was also a node in a network. The network had no name, no formal structure, no written charter. It was made of trust and necessity and the specific kind of solidarity that people develop when they understand that they are operating in a world designed to make them invisible. It connected free black residents of Byrd County with enslaved people on the surrounding plantations, and through those connections outward to other networks along the coast, to Charleston, to Savannah, to the communities of free black people in the port cities who had their own connections further north. Ada had spoken to Thomas Waring, perhaps 6 or 7 times in the previous 3 years, never directly about anything that required a direct statement. The communication between them had been built in pieces over those brief encounters at the market in the specific coded indirectness of people who have learned to speak in environments where direct speech is dangerous. She knew what he was. He knew what she was. They had never needed to make it explicit. On the Thursday morning, after she received the document from Elias, she loaded her basket onto the cart that went to Bowert, took her usual seat in the back, and watched St. Helena Island pass on bow. These sides as the cart made the crossing to the mainland, and then the road into Bower. The market was busy that morning. The Thursday market in Beaufort was one of the social centers of the county, a place where the economic and social life of the area concentrated into a few hours of transaction and negotiation. White planters and their wives and household staff, free black residents, enslaved people sent in with goods to sell, merchants, dremmen, the occasional traveler coming through. Thomas Waring was there with his cart, as he usually was, moving a load of rice sacks from the end of the market toward one of the warehouses on the waterfront road. Ada did not approach him directly. She set up her basket at the usual spot and spent the first hour of the market selling the goods she had brought: preserved vegetables, a small quantity of the honey from the hives kept near the woodline, some of the woven sweet grass work that the women at Heron's Rest made, and that sold well to the Beaufort housewives, who had come to appreciate its quality. At a natural pause in the morning, when the cart had gone, and the market had thinned slightly and the particular configuration of people in her immediate vicinity was right, she walked with her basket to the corner where Thomas's mule was tied. She set the basket down beside the mule's water bucket, as though resting it, while she stopped to speak to the man refilling the bucket nearby. She said a few words to the man with the bucket. She picked up the basket and moved on. When Thomas came back to his cart an hour later to reload for the afternoon, he found a folded packet of papers in the water bucket, weighted down by a small stone so they would not float or blow away. He dried them carefully on the seat of his cart, inside the protective cover of the canvas he used for rain. That evening in the back room of the Free Black Methodist church he attended on Port Republic Street, Thomas Waring sat with the document for 3 hours and read it all the way through twice. He sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of the empty room. He had understood many things about the situation in Buffett County. He had lived inside the architecture of that situation his entire life. The free black man who was free in a technical sense that did not extend very far, who moved within a system that regarded his freedom as a provisional arrangement subject to revocation at any moment of sufficient inconvenience, who had learned to navigate that system with the specific combination of strategic visibility and absolute discretion that his survival required. What he was holding in his hands was something different from anything he had encountered before. It was not a request for help. It was not a communication asking him to pass something along. It was a document that, if it landed in the right place, could move the particular stone that was sitting on the particular lever that was currently pressing down on the life of a man he had never met. He read the section about the coffin again, about the advance order, about the timing, about what the physician had been asked to prepare. He read the section about the 1854 transaction discrepancy. He read the section about Mattie on the Pringle plantation. He turned it over and read the last section again, the one about the fire. Then he folded it carefully, wrapped it in oilcloth against the autumn humidity, and put it in the hiding place he kept behind the loose board in the church's back wall, where it would stay until he decided what to do with it. He had decided by morning, but it would take him 6 more days to act. If this story is giving you chills, if you're asking yourself how much of this could actually be true, share this video with someone who loves dark history. Hit that like button and leave your theories in the comments. The story is far from over, and what happens next is the part that changes everything. Edwin Tabb arrived at Heron's Rest on the 14th of November 1859, which was 4 days before the document would be placed in the hands of a boot attorney and 9 days before Elias would die. He came on horseback alone in the mid-morning when the low November light was coming across the marsh at a flat angle that turned the water in the tidal creek to pewter and made the dead stalks of the summer's vegetation into something that looked almost architectural. He was a man of about 50, lean and somewhat dry in his manner, dressed in the clothing of a professional who traveled frequently and valued practicality over statement. He carried a leather case of the kind used by appraisers and surveyors, flat with brass clasps worn at the corners. He had a letter from Hollis Crane in Charleston. Wendell Drayton read the letter in the front hall while Tabb waited in the parlor. The letter was brief and calibrated in the way of a communication from a man who had thought carefully about every word he was writing and what effect each word might have. It explained that Tabb was Crane's representative. That his purpose was to conduct an appraisal of the plantation's assets in connection with the settlement of the outstanding financial matter, and that his access to the property's records and personnel would be appreciated as a courtesy that Crane was confident Drayton would find it in his interest to extend. Drayton folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He stood in the front hall for a moment, the kind of moment that has no observable external content. but in which a significant amount of internal calculation occurs. Then he went back to the parlor and greeted Tab with the warmth of a man who was very good at not showing what he actually felt. He offered Tab dinner, a room for the night, and full access to the plantation beginning the following morning. Tab thanked him and accepted all three. That evening at the dinner table, the two men and Catherine Drayton, who sat at the far end of the table and spoke, when spoken to with the practiced ease of a woman who had long since learned to perform that particular social function. The conversation covered cotton prices, the weather, the political situation in Washington, and the relative merits of several approaches to the late-season management of Sea Island cotton. Tab asked intelligent questions. He knew enough about the business to ask questions that sounded interested rather than intrusive. Drayton answered them with the measured generosity of a man who was uncertain how much this guest already knew and was not prepared to supply any surplus information. Catherine said nothing about the ledger, which he had been maintaining all year, and which was sitting in the study containing everything. After dinner, Tab retired to the guest room. Drayton went to his study and sat at the desk without lighting a lamp for nearly half an hour. The following morning, Tab walked the property with Corwin, the overseer who had been given no specific instructions about what to say, and who consequently said very little, which was in its own way informative. Tab moved through the fields, the outbuildings, the kitchen, the stables. He made notes in a small leather journal. He was the kind of man whose note-taking was itself a performance of authority. The act of writing things down, establishing without any words being spoken, that this was a formal exercise with formal consequences. He came to the woodshed. He opened the door and stood in the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer interior. The woodshed was a working space. It smelled of sawdust and oil, and the particular slightly medicinal smell of the shellac compound Elias had been using for the last piece of cabinet work he had been able to complete. The tools hung on their pegs and brackets along the walls, in the methodical order of a craftsman's space, each in its place, each in the condition that a man who respects his tools maintains. The bench was clean. There was a half-finished piece of chair framing on the bench not recently worked on. The dust on it told you it had been there for some weeks. And against the far wall in the space that would have been used for lumber storage was the coffin. Tab looked at it. It was not something you could miss. A box of that size and that specific shape in a room that had no other items of comparable dimension. He noted the quality of the construction. He noted the iron handles. He noted the fitted lid. He stepped forward and placed one hand flat on the lid for a moment, then withdrew it. He wrote something in his journal. He closed the woodshed door and continued the tour. That afternoon, he requested the plantation ledger. Drayton brought it from the study personally, which was in itself an unusual choice. Normally, such an administrative task would have been delegated. He set it on the table in the parlor and remained in the room while Tab went through it, seated across from him with a cup of tea he did not drink. Tab turned the pages methodically. He was looking at the asset valuations, the labor records, the financial transaction entries for the past 3 years. He found the entry for Elias, current value, $850. He found Voss's medical notation from the previous month. He cross-referenced the dates. He found the delivery entry for the coffin. Ada, who had reason to be working in the room directly above, mending the curtains in the upstairs hallway, a task that had been assigned that day on that floor by what appeared to be entirely routine household scheduling, heard the turning of pages below. She heard the specific silence that falls between two people when one of them has found something. She heard Tab clear his throat. She heard Drayton say, "Is there something in particular you'd like to discuss?" She heard Tab say, "I think we have everything I need for the preliminary report. I'll draft it this evening." The silence that followed that exchange lasted several seconds and had a quality to it that was different from ordinary conversational silence. It was the quality of a silence between two people who are both calculating simultaneously, both aware that a card has been noted without being played. Tab left Heron's Rest on the morning of November 16th. He rode back toward Beaufort in the early light with his leather case and his journal. He posted his preliminary report to Hollis Crane in Charleston from the Beaufort post office that afternoon. The report contained the two observations that would change everything. The first, that the plantation's most valuable individual asset appeared to be in terminal decline, with a coffin already on the property, suggesting the end was expected imminently. The second, a question. A single carefully worded question placed in the final paragraph of the report after all the valuations and condition assessments in a position that made it look almost like an afterthought and was almost certainly not. Why had a coffin been delivered to the property more than a month before the death? It was presumably intended for at a time when the asset in question was still living and still listed at full current value. The report was in Hollis Crane's hands within 4 days. Crane read it on the morning of November 20th. He read it twice and then he sat it down on the desk and stared at the wall of his Charleston office for a long time because a man in his position could not afford to be in the middle of a scheme that, if it came to light, would make him appear complicit in a deliberate falsification of legal documents, not because he had participated in it, but simply because it had occurred in connection with a debt he held, and because in the world of Charleston commercial law, proximity to scandal was almost as damaging as scandal itself. Everything that happened in the last week of November 1859 and the first weeks of December moved quickly and in directions that none of the people who had set the pieces in motion had entirely predicted. On the 22nd of November, the day before Elias died, Thomas Waring had his meeting with the Beaufort attorney, James Ellison. Ellison was a man in his late 40s, a Beaufort native who had studied law in Columbia and returned to practice in the town where he had grown up. He was not a radical. He was not in any sense that the word would have meant in 1859 South Carolina, a reformer. He was a careful man who had built a modest but solid reputation over 20 years of practice by being methodical, discreet, and precise about the limits of what was possible within the law as it actually existed. He had on occasion assisted free black residents of the county in legal matters, not because he held strong convictions about it, but because the work was usually uncomplicated, and the people who came to him were usually careful, and the fees, while modest, were reliable. He had received Thomas Waring's written communication 3 days earlier and had spent those 3 days thinking about whether to respond and how. He responded because the document, as Waring had described it, was not primarily a legal instrument. It was a piece of leverage, and Ellison understood leverage. They met in the back room of a warehouse on the waterfront road that Waring used for storage during the week, and that was empty on Tuesdays. Ellison arrived first and sat in the dimness with his hands folded, looking at the light coming under the door, thinking about what he was about to do and whether it was what he actually wanted to do. Waring arrived with the document in its oilcloth wrapping. Ellison read it. He read it carefully and completely, turning the irregular pages in the low light, leaning forward over the crate that was serving as a table. He was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then he looked at Waring and said, "This was written by Elias himself." Waring said, "Yes." Ellison said, "And the material in it." He witnessed these things himself. Waring said he was specific about what he saw and what he concluded. "It's there and how it's written." Ellison was quiet again. He said, "I can't use this in a court. You understand that?" Waring said, "I know." Ellison said, "But courts aren't the only place where things get resolved." He sat back. He looked at the warehouse ceiling, at the particular pattern of light and damp shadow on the old boards above them. He was thinking through the specific geometry of the situation. Who needed what from whom, where the pressure points were, and what kind of message delivered in what kind of way would produce the result without requiring anything to be stated directly. He said if someone who had reason to be interested in the administration of this particular debt were made aware through appropriate channels that certain information was in circulation, information that could complicate the debt settlement in various ways, how do you think that person would respond? Waring said depends on what he values more, the money or his reputation. Ellison said, "Those things are usually the same thing for men of that type." He stood up. He said, "I'm going to need to be very careful about how I do this, and you need to be clear that what you're asking me to do, I'm doing as an attorney advising a client, and you are my client in this matter, in the sense that what passes between us is protected." Ellison said, "And the document stays with you, not with me." Waring said, "Understood." Ellison picked up his hat. He stood for a moment at the door, his hand on the latch. He said, "The man who wrote this, is he going to survive long enough to know how it comes out?" Waring said, "Probably not." Ellison looked down at the door latch. He said, "No, I don't suppose that changes anything, does it?" And he went out into the November afternoon. Elias died on the 23rd of November at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. He died in the small house near the edge of the Heron's Rest property, with Nora on one side of the bed and a woman named Ruth on the other. Ruth was 60 years old and had been sitting with the dying for as long as anyone at Heron's Rest could remember, not because she had been assigned to it, or because it was one of her designated duties, but because she had come to it naturally over the years in the way that certain people come to the roles that a community needs and cannot formally create. She knew what dying felt like in the small hours, and she knew how to be present in it without filling it with anything it did not need. The night had been cold, the coldest of the autumn so far, with a wind off the Atlantic that found every gap in the walls of the small house and moved through it at floor level like something looking for something. The single candle they kept lit gutted and steadied and gutted again. Outside, the marsh was quiet in the specific way of low tide at 4 in the morning, the way of water that is not quite still, but is moving too slowly to make a sound. In his last hours, Elias had been intermittently lucid. He had spoken during those lucid periods with a clarity and deliberateness that Ruth, who had witnessed many deaths, later said was unusual. Not the clarity of a man fighting against what was happening, but the clarity of a man who had finished what he needed to finish and was moving through the remaining time with intention. He had said things to Ruth that he asked her to remember, not prayers, not final requests in the usual sense. He spoke names, Ada, Thomas. He spoke a description, the location of a particular loose board in a particular building in Beaufort, as he had been told it was described to him by Nora, who had been told by Ada, who had been told by Waring on the previous Thursday. He told Ruth what it meant that those names and that location existed together in the same sentence. He asked her to hold those names in her memory until they were no longer needed. He spoke to Nora. What he said to Nora, Louisa Ames was told years later, but chose not to write down in full out of a discretion that she explained in a brief annotation as belonging to her and not to any record. What she did write was a fragment. He told her that the work was done. He died between one sound of the marsh wind and the next. Nora did not make a noise. Ruth sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the candle which burned steadily now, the wind having dropped outside across the property in the woodshed, 60 feet from the small house. The coffin was where it had been for 6 weeks. It was carried out that morning as the sky over the marsh went from black to gray to the particular cold, pale blue of a November dawn in the low country. Henry and George, who had brought it in, were the ones who brought it out. They did not speak while they did it. Other men from the quarters joined them to carry it to the small house. The people from the quarters came together the way they always came together for a death in the specific rhythm of a community that had buried its own for generations, under conditions that required the ceremony to be theirs, because no other ceremony was available. They moved through the cold morning in their good clothes, the clothes kept for Sundays and for funerals, and they gathered around the small house. And the women sang, and the men who had known Ilas longest stood nearest, and the ceremony was long enough to be worthy of the man and his life. And Wendell Drayton did not attend. The burial was at the edge of the property in the plot that held the dead of Heron's Rest, going back further than anyone see. Old precisely remember. The coffin went into the ground on the 23rd of November, 1859, the only coffin in that row of graves. And 3 miles away, in Beaufort, James Ellison sat in his office and wrote a letter that was going to Charleston on the afternoon post. The letter did not contain anything explicit. It contained the suggestion worded with the careful indirection of a man who understood that the message and the message behind the message were not the same thing, that certain information had come to the attention of a party in Beaufort County regarding the administration of a plantation in which Mr. Crane had a significant financial interest, that this information, while not currently in circulation in any formal channel, was of a nature that might attract the attention of certain interested parties if it were to become more widely known, and that it seemed possible, given the particular sensitivity of the situation, that a resolution of the outstanding debt at terms recently discussed might represent the most straightforward path forward for all concerned. He signed it with his name and sent it. 4 days later, Hollis Crane's secretary dispatched a response. The response was brief. It expressed Mr. Crane's appreciation for the attorney's communication and indicated that Mr. Crane was prepared to discuss a revised settlement of the outstanding obligation on terms that he believed both parties would find satisfactory. The meeting was conducted by letter and intermediary over the following 2 weeks. The settlement was signed on December 19, 1859. The debt was retired. The terms compared to those originally agreed were favorable to Drayton in ways that a man in Crane's position would not have agreed to without some form of pressure being applied. The provision allowing for forced sale of human property was dissolved. The entire matter was concluded and filed as a routine commercial settlement. The people who had made it happen, Elias, Nora, Ada, Thomas Waring, James Ellison, would not all know during their lifetimes the full shape of what they had accomplished together. They had operated in pieces, each holding their portion of the plan, trusting that the other portions were being held by people who understood what they were for. That was in itself a kind of extraordinary achievement. Extraordinary not because it involved anything miraculous, but because it involved something much harder: trust and precision, and the willingness to act carefully under conditions designed to make careful action impossible. Just when we thought we'd seen everything that this story had to offer, the full weight of what Elias had built, not with wood, not with tools, but with words and time and the radical act of writing the truth, begins to come into focus. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. 1. Let's discover together what happened in the years after Elias was buried. Ada remained at Heron's Rest until the Union forces took St. Sax, Helena Island in the first days of November 1860, when the gunboats appeared in Port Royal Sound on the 7th of that month, and the Beaufort County planting community fled the Sea Islands in a chaos of carriages and trunks and impulsive decisions. Heron's Rest underwent the transformation that the rest of the island's plantations underwent. The white family departed, and the people who had always been there stayed. The Drayton family packed what they could carry and were gone within a day. Wendell and Catherine and the children in the same carriage, moving fast toward the ferry crossing and the mainland and the world of the Confederacy they had chosen. I'd not say goodbye to anyone. The people who remained on St. Helena Island were not passive inheritors of what followed. They organized. They continued working the cotton fields under their own direction under an arrangement worked out with the Union officers who arrived after the naval bombardment had secured the Sound. They were among the first formerly enslaved people in the South to work the land they had always worked under conditions they had partially chosen. And the fact that they were there, that the plantation still functioned, that the cotton still grew is partly a function of the knowledge they carried and partly a function of the decision they made to stay and stake their claim to what they had. Ilta was among the first to register her name with the Union authorities. She gave it clearly and completely. Ada, formerly the property of Wendell Drayton, Heron's Rest, St. Helena Island. She gave her age as 43. She gave her occupation as seamstress. She said she was a free woman and intended to remain so. The Union officer who recorded her name noted in his register that she was calm and precise, that she answered every question directly and without elaboration, that she appeared to find the administrative act of registering as a free person entirely unremarkable, as though it was simply the formal acknowledgement of a status she had already been holding in her own accounting for some time. She learned to write in the freedmen schools that the Northern missionaries and teachers established on St. Helena in the spring of 1862, the extraordinary project that became known as the Port Royal Experiment, one of the most significant and least remembered episodes in the history of American education and social reform. She was among the adult students, the ones who came to the schoolrooms at night or on Sundays, who approached learning with the specific intents of people who had been told for their entire lives that this knowledge was not meant for them and who wanted it all the more completely for that reason. Louisa Ames, who arrived on St. Helena in the late winter of 1862 as part of the first group of Northern teachers, first met Ada in a classroom. Ada was practicing her letters on a slate, sitting at a desk built for a child, writing the same sentence over and over in the careful, deliberate way of someone who is not yet fully in control of the pen, but is working toward it with absolute determination. They became, over the months that followed, something more than teacher and student. They became in the specific and uncategorizable way of two women who find in each other a kind of mutual recognition that cuts across the differences in their backgrounds and their positions. Friends, the kind of friends who can sit together in silence and have both of them find it productive. It was in the context of that friendship, across a series of conversations that extended over most of 1862 and 1863, that Ada told Louisa everything she knew about Ulas and the coffin and the document, and what had happened in the autumn of 1859. She told it carefully in the order it had happened without embellishment. She told it as a person tells a story that belongs to someone else and that she has been carrying as a caretaker carries a valuable object with responsibility, with the intention of passing it to someone who can do something with it. Louisa Ames wrote it down. She wrote it in her own words in the cramped pencil hand of a woman who had been writing quickly in inadequate light for months on the paper that was available, which was thin and sometimes damp, and which the humidity of the low country did not treat kindly. She made notes in the margins. She recorded questions. She still had facts she hadn't been able to verify the names of. People she wanted to speak to. She spoke to Ruth, who was still on the island and who was now in her early 60s, and who sat in the corner of the small room Louisa had been given in one of the plantation outbuildings, and spoke for 2 hours without being asked more than a handful of questions. Ruth had a memory that was extraordinary, not in the sense of being comprehensive about everything, but in the sense of being exact about certain things, the particular things that she had decided at some point in her life were worth keeping exactly. The things Elias had said on his last night, she repeated to Louisa Ames in a way that made it clear they had not been altered in the 4 years since she had first heard them. Thomas Waring came to St. Helena in the summer of 1863, when the Butte mainland had been under Union control for long enough that movement between the island and the town had become easier. He came to see a relative who had remained on the island, and he was pointed toward Louisa Ames by 2 separate people who had heard she was collecting the history of the plantation community. He sat with her for an afternoon in the garden behind the school building, and he told her his portion of the story, the document, the warehouse meeting with Ellison, the letter to Crane. He told her the document still existed. He told her it was in a secure location, maintained in the oilcloth against the humidity. He told her that after the war was over and the legal situation of the formerly enslaved people of South Carolina was clarified, he intended to see whether anything could be done with it formally. Louisa Ames asked him whether Elias had known when he was dying whether the plan had worked. Waring was quiet for a moment. He said the settlement happened the 19th of December. Elias died on the 23rd of November. He didn't know. He paused, he said. But I think he knew it was go into work. Not because he was certain, but because he'd built it to work. He'd thought about it the way he thought about it, the way he thought about a piece of construction. What load it would need to bear, where the stress would fall, whether the joints would hold. He built it to carry the weight it needed to carry. Louisa Ames wrote this down. In the margin next to it, she wrote a single word, true. She left St. Helena in the spring of 1865. As the war was ending and the future of the Sea Islands was becoming something that needed to be negotiated in Washington, rather than managed in schoolrooms, she took her notes with her in a leather satchel that was one of only 3 bags she was able to carry on the boat back to the mainland. She tried in the years after the war to place the story of Elias somewhere public in a journal, in a newspaper, in one of the volumes being assembled by Northern reformers about the experience of the formerly enslaved people of the Sea Islands. She was unable to do so in a form that satisfied her. The journals that would have been interested wanted something that was either more verifiable or more dramatic. The newspapers of the era, with the exception of a few abolitionist sheets that were already preaching to their converted readers, had no interest in a story whose principal character was an enslaved carpenter who had outwitted a planter through the patient act of writing and waiting. The story did not fit neatly into the narratives that 1865 and 1866 were producing. Narratives of battles and generals and the great official machinery of emancipation. It was too quiet, too particular, too granular in its specific details. It did not have a moment of triumph that could be described in a single paragraph and placed on a front page. Louisa Ames put her notes in a box and the box in storage, and eventually the box went to her family in Massachusetts. And from her fess, Amelie, it went to an archive at a university, and for many decades it sat there labeled with her name and the dates of her time on the island and the dates of her time on the island in the particular kind of dormant waiting that paper does when it contains something that has not yet found its moment. The settlement document between Wendell Drayton and Hollis Crane sits in the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston in a collection of 19th century commercial papers. It does not explain itself. It notes the date, the parties, the terms, the mutual releases. It is signed by both men and witnessed. It is from the outside entirely unremarkable. Drayton lost Heron's Rest in 1862 when the Union government levied a direct tax on Confederate properties, and the Beaufort County plantations whose owners had fled was seized for non-payment. He resettled on the mainland in Columbia, where he practiced law again for several years. A diminished practice in a diminished city in a world that had changed more completely than he had been prepared for. He died in 1871. The cause of death is listed in the Columbia records as general decline. Catherine Drayton outlived him by 11 years. She returned to the Beaufort area after the war and lived with relatives near the mainland town. She never returned to St. Helena Island. She died in 1882, having never, so far as any surviving record suggests, spoken publicly about the autumn of 1859, or the coffin, or the man for whom it had been ordered in advance, whether she knew what her husband had been planning, whether she had understood the full geometry of the scheme at the time, or whether she had understood it only later, in the retrospect, that the war and the collapse of everything they had built forced upon her, is a question that Louisa Ames' notes do not resolve. There is one entry from a conversation Ames had not with Ada or Ruth, but with a woman who had worked in the Drayton household in the later years and who had known Catherine in that period, that touches on it obliquely. The woman said, Mrs. Drayton kept very good records. She always knew what was in the ledger. She always knew what the ledger said. The implication of this, the suggestion that Catherine's meticulous record-keeping was not the habit of an obedient wife, but the deliberate act of a woman who wanted there to be a record she controlled, is one of those threads in the story that Louisa Ames identified, but could not follow to its end. It is one of the questions that the story leaves open. It will probably remain open. The graves at the edge of the Heron's Rest property survived the war in the way that unmarked graves survived when the people who know whose they are continue to know. The families who had been on that land and who bought parcels of it in the Port Royal land sales of 1863 and 1864 maintained the burial ground. They knew the names. They knew the rows. They knew with the specific geographic memory of people who have cared for their dead for generations which grave was which. One of those graves had a coffin. 30 years after the war in the early 1890s, a man who had grown up on what had been the Heron's Rest property told a teacher at the Bowford School about the burial ground, about the man with the carpenter's hands, about the one grave that was different from the others. He described what he had been told about the coffin and why it was there. And the teacher, a young woman who had come from Georgia and who was new to the island and its histories, wrote a letter to a relative in the north describing what she had been told because she found it arresting and strange and did not know what to do with it. The letter was preserved by accident in a collection of family papers donated to a Southern University archive in the 1960s, where it sits alongside documents of considerably greater official importance that no one pays any particular attention to. It says there was a man here named Elias who was a carpenter. He was buried in a coffin that was ordered for him before he died. The person who told me about him said that the coffin had been meant for something else entirely and that Elias had known what it was meant for and had found a way to take it back. He was the only one buried that way. No one ever explained it publicly. The people who know about it keep it for themselves, but they say the coffin was his. He decided what it was for. And somewhere in a county archive in South Carolina, in a collection of commercial papers from the 1850s, the debt settlement sits in a manila folder with no one to tell it what it cost to produce. And in a university archive in Massachusetts, the notes of a school teacher named Louisa Ames wait in a box labeled with her name and 2 dates, the years she spent on an island where an extraordinary thing happened quietly in the dark, in a small house near the edge of a marsh. What do you think about what Elias chose to do with what he had? About what it means that the most powerful thing a man in his position could build was not something made of wood, but something made of words and truth? Leave your comment below. Tell us where you're listening from. If this story stayed with you, if it made you ask what parts of history are still waiting in boxes and archives to be told, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear a story like this one. See you in the next video.